All right, everybody, welcome into another episode of Stadium Seat Sports. As always, I am Coop here with my partner and co-host Kriv. And like we talked about in our last, released video here, we're going to be previewing this upcoming first round of matchups in the 12-team college football playoff. So, Kriv, we're going to be going over four matchups here. I think, we got different variations of how excited we are for each of these games, which game we think is the biggest. But I think we're just going to go in order, starting with the Friday night game, which is of course an in-state game.
Yeah.
The Indiana Hoosiers taking on the Notre Dame Fighting Irish. So I'll throw it over to you. This is a really intriguing matchup to me. Probably the second most intriguing matchup to me. First being Tennessee Ohio State in my opinion, but this game is a close second for me. I think it's going to be an interesting matchup. So I'm excited to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it is absolutely a unique game in the sense that it's an in-state game. And I mean, I can't remember when these teams last matched up or
Mhm.
what. So it's pretty unique in that sense. The other thing I think that they both have in common is people like to point out they haven't really played anyone
Mhm.
for Indiana. And I would argue that Notre Dame is also the same.
Yeah. I mean, I would think Indiana has actually played somebody of higher caliber in Ohio State. Granted, they lost that game and they
Yeah,
didn't look great in it, but that's a higher quality opponent than I think anybody that Notre Dame has played. Texas A&M looked great at the beginning of the year, but Texas A&M struggled at times throughout the year. So Indiana's had the toughest opponent, I think.
yeah, I agree with that assessment. Notre Dame, I think their biggest win was against Army, who,
Mhm.
as we've seen, especially last week, I mean, things have played out differently. Army's not that undefeated team that they ran up against. So, but really for me, this game kind of breaks into a few points. So, one, Notre Dame, their defense has been very good to
Mhm.
elite. That is their strength. That is what they lean on. That's going to travel well no matter where you are. I know they're the home team, but I mean that
Right.
in the sense that this is a pressure cooker game,
Mhm.
and that is very important. Where I have some hesitancies is Riley Leonard and the Notre
Sure.
Dame offense, and we saw it a lot early in the year, even against Texas A&M, which at the time you would have argued was a big win.
Mhm.
He can be used as a battering ram and use his legs, which I think is super helpful in these situations. But I feel like at some point he's going to be asked to throw the ball down the field, and he just has
Mhm.
not done that consistently. So if he can't do that, I think Indiana can hone in and try to limit the run the best they can.
Sure.
I really do like Rourke, the quarterback for Indiana. He outside of the Ohio State game, of course, he's played very well. You
Mhm.
can chalk that up to worse opponents or whatever you want, but he has shown flashes. He makes some great, accurate throws. Uh, we even saw it against Indiana, Michigan. He made a lot of really good throws that his
Mhm.
receivers just missed or dropped or
Yeah.
whatever. Like he is a gamer. He's very good. He's the X factor for Indiana. If he brings it, they're gonna have a chance. And
Yeah.
if they're able to find ways to score and put the Notre Dame offense in a position where they have to throw the ball, then
Mhm.
Indiana can win this. And I have full confidence in Kurt Cignetti to have a great game plan. You know he's going to have his guys ready to play. I think they learned a lot about themselves against Ohio State, good and bad. But that's
Sure.
something they can grow from and possibly bring it into this game. Notre Dame is very talented, but they're not Ohio State talent.
Right.
So I think Indiana has a chance here. I really, really want to pick them. It just seems like they might have it in them to do this. I'm going to still say Notre Dame pulls it out. Back to my original point with that defense. I think that
Mhm.
defense will just be too much for them to handle.
Yeah. I mean, look, and I think you touched on a lot of great points. Like, which Riley Leonard are we going to get? Because we
Yeah.
know how useful and skilled he is with his legs. And that in combination with their run game, just their general basic run game with the incredible offensive line that they have, like that's something that Notre Dame is just known for year in and year out is having great line play, but specifically offensive linemen. Like they send offensive linemen to the NFL as well as anybody in college football. So like we know that aspect is
Yeah.
very good for this Notre Dame football team. And especially here in cold weather late into the year, that is something that oftentimes you've got to be able to rely upon. But if Indiana stuffs the box, and they did a pretty decent job against Ohio State, granted, they didn't play their best game against Ohio State, but their defensive line has played pretty damn well this whole year. Like they've done a decent job of stopping the run.
Yeah.
So if Indiana just loads the box and is like, we're going to take that away from you, Notre Dame, and we're going to make Riley Leonard beat us with his arm, Riley Leonard can do it. But will he do it is the question. And so I think that that's an interesting thing to watch. So I think that was a great point by you. I'm in full agreement with you. Curtis Rourke for Indiana, I think, is one of the better quarterback stories we've had in college football this year. Like you said, even in that Ohio State game, he did not have his best game by any means. A lot of the Indiana football team didn't have their best game that day, but he made some throws, and he's made some throws throughout this year that are Sunday level throws. So like
Yeah.
you feel confident in Curtis Rourke's ability to come out and play the way he's played for a vast majority of the season. And so for me, it really boils down to, because I think this is a pretty evenly matched game, truthfully. I think that they kind of have positives and negatives in different areas when we're talking about both of these teams. But overall, I think this is a very intriguing matchup. I think Marcus Freeman's a great head coach. Notre Dame just extended him. And I think that that's an interesting move. I think that they see Marcus Freeman as kind of a hot commodity on
Oh
the
yeah.
coaching circle.
Yeah.
And they're like, we need to lock this guy up, right? Because it's like, if you were having any question marks about Marcus Freeman, you might wait to see what they do in this playoff run. But they're like, no, we trust this guy. We believe in this guy. And we are going to try and secure him to be a part of our program for the foreseeable future, because you know his name's going to be thrown out there when, you know, inevitably head coaching vacancies open up in college football. And so I think he and Kurt Cignetti are really kind of evenly matched in the coaching sphere. Like Kurt Cignetti's done a phenomenal job at Indiana. I think he's an amazing coach. And I think that Marcus Freeman is learning and growing from those ugly losses that Notre Dame has suffered in his tenure. And we're not talking about like the two losses to Ohio State. That's another blue blood program. Like there's no shame in losing to that team. Yes, granted, you want to win at least one of those when you have back-to-back years against that program. We're talking about, you know, Northern Illinois, Marshall. We're talking about those losses that
Yeah.
Notre Dame fans, and rightfully so, feel like we should not lose this game ever. And that's fair. But I think he's learned from those, and I think he's continuing to grow. So I think that that head coaching dynamic is also really interesting and intriguing in this matchup. I'm I'm gonna go opposite of you. I'm taking Indiana in this game. I think Indiana, rightfully so, is in this 12-team playoff field. I know they had one opportunity, one really good opponent in Ohio State, and they failed to prove that. But I don't think that Indiana is as bad as they looked in that game. And I think that we saw a really good version of Ohio State in that game. And we'll touch on Ohio State later and kind of, you know, which Ohio State version are we going to get? That game didn't sway me away from the Indiana Hoosiers in terms of thinking that they belong in this 12-team playoff field. So I think it's a close game. I think it's going to be a really hard fought, cold, tough Midwest battle. But I'm going to take the Hoosiers in the upset here and pick them to move on to the second round.
You know what? I absolutely love that. And you made a really good point too, how Indiana handled Ohio State's run game. Now, of course,
Mm-hmm.
Ohio State had O-line issues, but I just pulled it
Sure.
up here to look back real fast. Ohio State only ran for 115 yards, and they only
Mm-hmm.
averaged 4 yards per carry.
Yeah.
And Judkins, Henderson, you can even argue Will Howard. I mean, that's a similar running attack in a sense to what you
Mm-hmm.
might see from Notre Dame. So, um, you know what? I didn't have the guts to do it. You did. I'm going to switch my pick. I'm going
Oh
to go with
wow.
Indiana too. I
All right.
just, I don't know.
Hey, listen.
I think you're right. Like Notre Dame has a history of dropping games, especially on the big stage. I mean, we saw them
Yeah.
lose games in the playoffs. I know Marcus Freeman's the new man in charge, but give Kurt
Mm-hmm.
Cignetti 3 weeks to get ready. And
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I'm going with the upset too. I
All
changed my
right.
pick.
Hey, you
Yeah.
know what? I love it. I love it. Let's both
Yeah.
go with the Hoosiers here. I think it makes for an exciting watch and an exciting start to this 12-team playoff. So excited for that one. Next one we're going to jump into, like I talked about, it's going to be the 12 o'clock matchup on Saturday, 21st. It's going to be SMU going into Happy Valley to take on the Penn State Nittany Lions. And this one, I'll kind of take this one
Sure.
first here. This one's an interesting matchup to me. I think that this one, in my opinion, my personal opinion, has the highest likelihood to be a blowout, but I could also see it potentially having an upset in its in its outcome as well. And the reason I say this is we kind of touched on it in our last video, or I mentioned it briefly. Penn State and Drew Aller, although they lost that Big Ten championship game, I think you saw something from Penn State and Drew Aller where you were like, that's the Andy Kotelnicki offense we were waiting for at Penn State.
Yep.
We know how talented Drew Aller is. We know how talented Nicholas Singleton is. We know Tyler Warren. He's great. Like, we know how talented of a program and team Penn State is. We hadn't seen them put it together like that, even in a loss where you're like, okay, this is what this team could be. And they've got, in my opinion, easily the most favorable draw in this whole 12-team playoff, with being able to face SMU. If they win that, they go on to face Boise State in the second round. No disrespect to them, but that's easier than, Ohio State, Tennessee. Then they get to take on Oregon, et cetera. Like, they've got a pretty favorable path here if you're Penn State. But if we don't get that Drew Aller, if we don't get that Nicholas Singleton, if we don't get that Andy Kotelnicki in terms of his play calling, and they're a bit more conservative, or they don't have the proper game plan drawn up to kind of attack their favorable matchups in this game, similar to what they had in Ohio State, SMU is the type of team that can strike quickly, and they're the type of team that could jump out to a double-digit lead on you. And if you don't have your best stuff offensively speaking that day, you're playing catch up. SMU is not the team you want to play catch up against. And so that's the intriguing aspect to me, because SMU is that kind of quick strike offense team that could potentially put you, in a bind if you're Penn State, where you're like, we've got to strike quickly, and we're not always capable of doing so. So that to me is an interesting aspect of this to watch. Which Penn State do we get in this game? Similar to, like we talked about, into that Big Ten championship game, we both took Oregon in that game, but we did a little PSA, announcement here to James Franklin and Andy Kotelnicki: use Tyler Warren. That
Yep.
continues here, not just in this game, but however far Penn State goes in this postseason. Tyler Warren is such a dynamic player for your team. He is basically like a get out of jail free card for that Penn State offense and team as a whole. So continue to utilize him. Like, that's what you want to do if you're Penn State. Of course, use Nicholas Singleton, Drew Aller. You want to see him start to, or continue from what he did in the Big Ten championship game, to kind of be like a little bit of a dual threat guy, but also make those mid range to some some longer passes down the field, those 15+ yard passes that he's capable of doing, but doesn't always do. We want to see that as well. And so, with all that said, I talked about SMU, being a quick strike offense. They were down and out against Clemson in the ACC championship game. You thought, man, this might be a blowout. Give SMU credit. They came back, took them all the way to overtime, lost a heartbreaker, on a field goal by Clemson. But SMU showed resiliency, and we know they've got talent. Like, they've got a very talented team. So I think this game, like I said, I can't tell if I could see it being a blowout in Penn State's favor, or I could see SMU pulling off the upset. I believe Penn State found something in that Big Ten championship game against Oregon. And I think with several weeks to prepare, they know the favorable matchups that they have in this game at what positions. Like we talked about, Tyler Warren, Drew Aller, Nicholas Singleton, like, they know their star players. I think that they're going to have a good game plan in place. So I'm going to take Penn State in this game. And then I'm going to take them by double digits. I think it's just going to be a little bit too much for SMU. So I'm going to take Penn State in this game, and I'm going to take them by double digits.
Yeah, I could totally see that happening. I think the real story for this matchup is James Franklin in a big game. One,
Mm-hmm.
so
Sure.
he's never had a big game like this where his opponent was a lesser opponent to this extent, because that's not common. But uh, Rhett Lashley is an amazing coach. He
Mm-hmm.
really is. I mean, what he's done at SMU is incredible. Kevin Jennings, Brashard Smith. I mean, they got some real dogs on that offense.
Yeah.
And Lashley made a good point. either today or yesterday. But he said that outside of one bad quarter against Clemson, they pretty much outplayed them.
Sure.
And I mean, they
And that's
easily,
fair.
yeah, and they easily could be in a much different position had they won that game. So I don't want to count them out. The spread's -8.5. I think they do have a puncher's chance in this game. I think Penn State's offense from that Oregon game was super impressive, and if that
Mhm.
sticks, their defense will bounce back. They're going to be a dangerous team in this playoff. So I'm going to pick them to win as well, and probably right around 10 points or so. So yeah,
Yeah.
double digits for me, but just on the fringe.
Yeah, and I mean, listen, we'll move into this next game. We'll go a little bit quicker on this next one, but I didn't even hit on Penn State's defense, but they're phenomenal, and I don't take too much away from Penn State's defense giving up a decent amount of points against that Oregon offense because I think Ohio State's defense is also very good. I just think the Oregon offense is that efficient and is that good.
Yeah.
So we know how good the Penn State defense is. So I think that's a great point to end on here. And I'll throw it over to you to start first with this next game. That's going to be Clemson and Texas. This one's got some intriguing aspects to it as well. So I'll get your thoughts and then I'll quickly give you mine.
Yeah, you know what they say about the 5 versus 12 matchup in March Madness. It's one of the
Mm-hmm.
most dangerous upset brackets here, but I don't think that's going to be the case. I don't. Even though Texas hasn't necessarily beat anyone, the only truly good team they've played, or I guess playoff team, they lost to twice
Yep.
in Georgia. Quinn Ewers has looked pedestrian to an extent.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is now or never for them. I do believe this is Quinn Ewers' team. I think he's going to bounce back strong. I think Clemson showed a lot of weakness on the defensive side with the way they broke down and lost a big lead against SMU, which I
Mm-hmm.
think bodes very well for Texas. Texas got a few weeks to get healthy. I know they've had some receivers banged up like Bond. Uh, Honestly, I think they've I don't know if it's this week or not, but they're going to find a way to add Arch Manning to the game plans
Yeah,
more frequently.
I fully agree.
But Texas is -12 in this game. I think that's probably about right. I could see them winning by 2 touchdowns. Clemson, great job sneaking in, kicking Alabama out of the playoff. Um, they no one expected them here.
Mm-hmm.
I think they have talent, and I mean, of course, anyone has a chance that they could do it, but I think Texas is just too talented for them to keep up with, especially after seeing how they went head to head with the SMU. So I'm gonna go Texas here.
Yeah. Listen, I like the pick. I'm not going to go too in detail because I agree with a lot of what you said. I do think that this is Quinn Ewers' team, but I do wonder if part of his, part of him looking a little bit pedestrian this year from kind of what we all expected. He was one of the
Yeah.
Heisman front runners coming into the year. Same with Carson Beck. They both kind of have struggled. I wonder if there is a little bit of that, like you feel the almost like the proverbial monkey on your back, like Arch Manning is sitting there in the wings waiting, and you know some people, whether it's fans, some in the program, both want Arch Manning in the game over you. I wonder if that has played a little bit into Quinn Ewers struggling because we know it's not a talent issue. But we've touched on it before. Like I mentioned, the Clemson defense at times has looked very good. Other times, that run defense has gotten absolutely gashed. And I think that that's exactly what this Texas team needs to try and exploit in this game. The Clemson run defense has been very vulnerable at times this year. And I think that they need to exploit that. If you are Texas, they've got the talent. And I think that they can do it. Their offensive line has struggled a little bit in those two matchups with Georgia, but outside of that, they've been a very solid unit this year for the Longhorns. So I think that if Texas can run the ball efficiently, that obviously opens up the field for the Texas wide receivers and Quinn Ewers / Arch Manning if they both get in the game. That I think Texas does ultimately end up winning this game. I just we've seen some very good things from Clemson this year, and then we've seen some very, very bad things from Clemson this year. And I just don't know if we're going to get, a good version of Clemson or if we're going to get a version of Clemson that got their teeth kicked in against Georgia in week 1. And I know they've probably gotten a little bit better throughout the year, but they've also dropped some games that you're just like, how and why are you dropping these games?
Yep.
So I think 12, would you say it's 12, 12 and a
Yeah.
half the
Yep.
spread?
12. Yep.
I think that's a little high for me. I would probably, have it more 7.5 to 8, 8.5, somewhere in that range would be a little bit more confident for me, just because I don't know what we're going to get from the Texas QB room on a weekly basis or a game to game basis. But I'm going to take the Longhorns as well. I wouldn't take them quite in the spread, but I'll take them in this game.
Yeah, I agree. And I think this next matchup here, I mean, it's definitely the matchup of the first round.
Yeah.
Um, Highly anticipated, two gigantic programs with a rich history.
Mm-hmm.
Tennessee traveling to Ohio State. I'll let you kick things off here, but man, this is the
Yeah.
game that kind of is going to define the first round here.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's really not an argument unless you are just a fan of one of the other programs. Like this is the best matchup in the first round. Heck, depending on what happens the rest of the way, this might be one of the best matchups that we get in this first year 12 team college football playoff field in general in the first round with
Yeah.
Ohio State and Tennessee. It's got so many storylines to it. These teams and programs are, you know, the elite of the elite historically. For Ohio State, you've had in what Ohio State fans and probably the players' perspective would be a disappointing regular season with two regular season losses. Obviously, a 1 point loss on the road in Eugene to Oregon, nothing to hang your hat on. Oregon has looked like the most dominant team here, the entire regular season. But you're really focusing on that last loss against the University of Michigan for the fourth straight year. Ryan Day is under more pressure than any other coach in America. Like, can this Ohio State team bounce back from that Michigan loss with several weeks to prepare? Like, can they get that out of their minds, that ugly loss? Can Ryan Day and Chip Kelly actually call a game plan for the Ohio State Buckeyes that actually benefits the skill set that they have and exploit just the huge talent advantage they have over everybody in the country at wideout? Like, can they do that? We didn't see it in the Michigan game. They doubled down and just ran straight into the teeth of the defense, like you mentioned. And this Tennessee defensive line is absolutely phenomenal, similar to that Michigan defensive line. So if that is what Ryan Day and Chip Kelly draw up, they're in a lot of trouble here. The Ohio State Buckeyes are. Like, they need to utilize their skill set on the outside. And if you don't see that, you're going to have a very, very angry fan base there in Columbus. And it's obviously a home game for the Buckeyes. And so that's an intriguing thing for me. We obviously are pretty active on Twitter, and we've seen a lot of different stories out there, heard from Ryan Day himself, that they're going to do a ton of shifting on the offensive line. The offensive line, they've had a lot of injuries, and that could be very, and I think you're going to probably touch base on this too, so I won't go too into detail, but that could be potentially very problematic. Like, that is in a playoff game against a team caliber that is the Tennessee Volunteers. That's not necessarily the time you're going to be wanting to be rotating a bunch of different guys at different positions on your offensive line, a team, a unit where you've had some of your most significant struggles all throughout the year. Like that, it could work out beautifully, or it could end in like a dumpster fire situation. Like I don't see it going in one of the middle ground areas for me. And for the Tennessee, like I talked about, defensive line, similar to Michigan, phenomenal. Their defense as a whole, really, really solid. Really, really solid. Their running back is incredible. That's who they really like to lean on to give Nico Iamaleava a little bit more kind of freedom. Because if Sampson can get going, if he can get 5, 6, 7 yards a carry, which he's had plenty of those games this year, it opens up the field for the rest of that Tennessee offense. And I think that that's what they're going to try to do. They're going to try to pound the rock with Sampson and let Nico Iamaleava kind of do his thing and do a little bit of like spread out offense and get him comfortable, because he's a very young quarterback, but we know how incredibly talented he is. So that would be my suspicion for the Tennessee game plan. For Ohio State, you just hope Chip Kelly and Ryan Day draw up a better game plan than what they had for Michigan. Do not run straight into the teeth of the defense for this Tennessee Volunteer program. Utilize Jeremiah Smith, utilize Emeka Egbuka, utilize those incredible wideouts you have, and you have a very solid chance of winning this game. So this game to me has so many question marks. Like, I have gone back and forth so many times about who I actually feel comfortable picking, because to me, there's almost no program, no team to me that has been more bipolar than Ohio State this year. I
Yeah.
don't know week in and week out which Ohio State team we are going to get. Yes, the Ohio State Buckeyes lost to the Oregon Ducks, but that team losing that game, I looked at that team and I was like, you know what? That might have been the two best teams in America. That's a team that can win the national championship.
Yeah.
Then they played really well against the Indiana Hoosiers for the most part. At the end of that Penn State game, that was another one of their top 5 wins. They bullied Penn State for 5 minutes, running the ball and just running out the clock. That was incredibly impressive. And then they have a game like they have against Michigan. And you're like, which team are we going to get? Because if we get the Michigan team, I think the Tennessee Volunteers could blow the doors off the Buckeyes. If we get some of those other versions of Ohio State I talked about with the talent that they have, this team could go on and do incredible things. So I think that the question mark, and I think you and I both agree here, Ryan Day's coaching for his job, whether he gets terminated or not, if he loses this round or, what have you with that huge buyout, he's absolutely under so much pressure. And if you're an Ohio State fan or just the general public watching Ohio State, you don't feel confident in Ryan Day. He has shown you every reason in these big games to not be confident in him and his ability to actually make and close, or rather bridge the gap when you're going up against these other programs that have same in talent, relatively speaking. He does not show the ability to take that team to the next level like Urban Meyer has done with Ohio State, Jim Tressel, like all these other coaches that Ohio State has had that have gotten to them to that mountaintop. He shows an ability to regress with tons of talent. So that to me is the biggest question mark of all, is which Chip Kelly, which Ryan Day are we going to get? Uh, with that being said, I'll just give you my pick. I know I went on a long tangent here, and I'm sure you want to talk about it too. I'm going to slightly lean Ohio State. I think the 7.5 point spread is what it is too large for me. I'd take Ohio State like a field goal would be my view on it. I'm going to give them a very, very slight edge, and I'm going to pick Ohio State in this game. But I would take Tennessee in the points if it is still 7.5, what it was when it was opening.
Yeah. So one, I don't know if how you can take Ohio State in a field goal when they can't make them.
So
So that
that's fair. That's fair.
that's issue number one. Number two, yeah, I have zero faith in Ryan Day. I just
It's understandable.
you've seen it over and over in big games, and people go, oh well, like Georgia Ryan Day, that was so impressive. Well, it was impressive until they blew a big lead, a two-score lead, and lost. And on that final drive, when they got downfield, he inexplicably ran the ball and forced a field goal that was far out of range. So they had the game in hand there too.
Mm-hmm.
So I have no faith in him. He's 0-4 the last 4 years against Michigan. No Big Ten titles, no playoff wins. I think that's the biggest thing. I think Ohio State and Tennessee are both very talented. I think Ohio
Mm-hmm.
State's more talented. Um, I think Dylan Sampson is obviously the key for Tennessee. He is the engine that makes them go. He's the
Mm-hmm.
guy they can rely upon. Ohio State defensively has done a pretty good job against the run, and you can look at the Michigan game and be like, oh, well, they gave up that one big run to Mullins. That was it. That was one run to
Right.
Mullins, and that was a two broken tackles, free kind of break free type of run. So,
Well, and
um,
you gotta think that the op or the defense was on the field pretty much that entire game because the offense couldn't do anything.
yeah, and that's part of it too. So that's promising for Ohio State. Their defense has, outside the Oregon game, has played really well, and that
Mm-hmm.
was actually an inflection point for them after the Oregon game. They changed up how they bring pass rush, how they blitz, how they do stunts. They literally redid the whole defense after that.
Mm-hmm.
I think Nick Saban called them ordinary or normal. So
Antiquated. Yeah,
antiquated,
he called
yeah.
them
So
antiquated.
so
Yep.
they refreshed that. And
Mm-hmm.
I hopefully that's the same thing that the offense takes away from their last game,
Sure.
because that was an antiquated offense.
Mm-hmm.
That was not what Ryan Day was known for, and
No.
they did that weird run the ball towards the top five pick nine
Yeah, they
times,
ran it right at Graham.
9 times for 9 yards over their right guard Tegra Shabola, who is the worst lineman on the team.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and this is where I'm going to also. Ryan Day said today that Luke Montgomery is going to start at left guard. And if you're not familiar with him, that's because he's never started before.
Mm-hmm.
So he's starting his first ever career game in a playoff game.
Welcome to the big
Okay.
stage.
And then Tegra Shabola and Austin Sareveld, who was the previously starting left guard, he said he's going to rotate. So a first time starter and the worst lineman on the team rotating with an okay lineman.
Mm-hmm.
That That's the interior of their offensive line. That could be a recipe for disaster. Maybe Luke Montgomery is good. He's a highly recruited kid.
Yeah.
Um,
It's just a tough spot to be thrown into in your first, I
yeah,
mean,
yeah.
you
And
couldn't get a tougher spot.
so I think I think changing something on the offensive line after that performance, perfectly understandable. I think a rotation is borderline idiotic. At least stick with someone, and if they play poorly, then you can change them. But to
But
have
you know
guys
what
go,
that speaks to me though? That Ryan Day knows how much pressure he's under and that he is coaching. Like he literally is like a magician just trying to pull things out of a hat to see what works.
yeah, yeah,
Like that's a man that's not confident in himself.
maybe he starts with Shabola or Saraveld and Montgomery, and they look really good on that first drive, and they can go ahead and keep them there. But I just wanted to point that out that rotating
Yeah.
guards, first time starters, even if all three are rotating, it's not a formula for success. And
No,
maybe
I
like you
agree.
said, maybe it sticks. But with that being said, I really like Nico. I mean, he's been a little disappointing. He's been subject to some very bad plays,
Mm-hmm.
but so has Will Howard.
Yeah, for
So
sure.
they both have plays that leave you scratching your head, and they both make plays that you're like, wow, that was really nice.
Mm-hmm.
I will say, I'll be interested to see if Tennessee targets Davison Igbinosun. Uh, he's the hold master.
Yeah.
He's a free flag every time you throw it towards him. So
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if they trust Nico enough to do that, but it can't hurt the target. That's probably the weak spot on Ohio State's on defense. Uh, Offensively speaking, you hit the nail on the head. Ohio State cannot get into this. I'm tougher than you. Run the ball down their throat. I think you do everything you can to get the ball into Jeremiah Smith, Emeka Ibuka, Cardinal Tate.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever you have to do. I know Judkins and Henderson are elite, but the offensive line isn't where it needs to be to
Yeah.
lean on them. So
And
you
you'd be
lean,
running straight into the strength of that Tennessee defense.
yeah, exactly. And I'd really like to see them utilize Ibuka and Smith specifically, whether that be wide receiver reverses, pop passes,
Mm-hmm.
um, just get the ball in their hands. Do things that gets them to the perimeter and gets them in space. And of
Think Curtis
course,
Samuel back in the day.
yeah, exactly. Curtis Samuel, Paris Campbell, and I think both these guys are probably better than both those guys.
Mm-hmm.
So I think they could do more with that. And then also, honestly, five deep balls tossed up to Jeremiah Smith. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if he's defended or not. You just
Yeah.
throw it up to him,
It's probably going to
and
get a flag.
yeah, and that's something they didn't do. And the last point I want to make, Ohio State needs to play with tempo. Uh, they they
100%.
they abandoned tempo all year. Uh, and Ryan Day said it's because he likes Will Howard to have a huddle and to speak to people into their face.
Mm-hmm.
That's also dumb.
I agree.
Every time Ohio State's gone up tempo, they've played great. So, like the 2 minute drill against Michigan, the only time they looked like a good offense that whole game was
Yep.
when they went up tempo. And up tempo will tire out this Tennessee defense. They have a very good defensive line. I feel like their linebackers are a little weak. Their secondary is good, but it's young and inexperienced. So if you can go up tempo and get that D line huffing and puffing, I think Ohio State wins. I will say this strictly comes down to Ryan Day, Chip Kelly.
Yep.
I think if they can get out of their own way and use the weapons ahead of them, they can win this game. I don't know if that's going to happen. I think I could easily see either team winning. I agree. I think it's going to be a very small margin.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I'm going to pick Ohio State because they are the home team. They do have uh, just a notch above a little bit more talent.
Sure.
But yeah, I think this is going to be a fun one. Hopefully Ryan Day just coaches free.
Yeah.
If he's in his head, the Michigan game, that loss is not going to be as ugly as this loss.
Mm-hmm.
Because Tennessee will take care of them a lot better. So
Yeah. And you hit the nail on the head before we like end the show. Like you mentioned, Ryan Day is always in his feels, it seems like, in terms of being called soft and having this program not be tough as nails. If I'm
Yep.
Josh Heupel and that Tennessee team, I'd be having press conferences this week saying that exact thing, even if you don't think it's true about the Ohio State
Yeah,
program,
get in his
because
head.
Ryan Day has shown an inability to not take that personally, and he will play right into your hand. Like
Yeah,
I would literally do that. I
yeah,
would.
yeah. Say, hey, I don't think they can run between the tackles, and he will
Yeah.
do that 20 times a
He will
game.
take that
So,
so personally that he will run straight into
yeah,
the absolute elite nature of that Tennessee defensive line. He will do
yeah,
it,
yeah.
truthfully. So I think that was a great point by you. And I think this game's going to be phenomenal. I'm really hoping all these games are great. I cannot wait to get this 12 team playoff started. Guys, if you made it through this video or you watch any of our videos, really appreciate you guys. Can't wait to make more videos about this 12 team playoff and the second round matchups we're going to have. So let's go out. Let's enjoy these first four matchups we have. Hope for some great games, and then we'll catch you guys on the next video.
Yep.